This is a tower I decided to make in honor of my current D&D character. She's called Narissa and she's a water genasi moon druid. So I thought what better way to honor her than to have this tower popping out of the water. My main idea was, what if she was an NPC in another band of adventurers' travels and they had to get to her somehow. So there's no visible doors. There's definitely going to be some sort of shenanigans in order to get in and up to the top of the tower to find her. Now I'm just using my Proxon hot wire cutter and the classic pink XPS foam to rough out the shape of the hills, so the base that we're going to be putting the tower on, so that I can get a good idea of how I want the whole shape to end up. I just did this super rough and I'm using a handheld hot wire cutter as well just to make some more detailed cuts. I'm really just sort of chucking bits together, taking them off, putting them back on again until I get to a shape that I'm happy with. I didn't have a super clear plan before I started this. I'm more of a throw things together and see how it happens kind of a gal. Then I'm using some definitely not knockoff No More Nails glue, which I think you call construction adhesive on the other parts of the world, just to keep things nice and strong and together. So because of drying times and things like that, I kind of had to go back and forth between base and tower. I'm going to try and edit them sort of together in chunks to make things a bit easier. So I had a few different ideas for how I could make the rock texture. I did make those plaster rock molds, but I didn't end up using them. I didn't really like them as much as the actual bark that I'd collected. So I'm just hacking away some space to stick them in, and yep, some really safe knife skills. Yep, and she's broken the knife. Well done, me. Don't follow this at home. Really don't. So now I'm just using these bits of bark, snapping bits off, sort of trying to fit them together, figuring out how to sort of jigsaw them into place. It was a little bit difficult to get a good sort of flow between them, but I managed in the end with a little bit of hot glue to keep everything together. And then I decided to use some Sculpting mold, so I poured some out and you just mixed it with a little bit of water. At some points I added a little bit of PVA glue just to get it into sort of a little bit of a stronger consistency, and then you just smash it all over. I tried to fill in as many gaps as I could, sort of pushing it in there just to kind of fill it in so there won't be as much resin leakage. Fingers crossed. Stay tuned to see if that worked. So I just smoothed it all over the outside, kind of trying to make a bit of rock texture, making it a little bit smoother on the top so where it would be covered in grass, and sort of working it in. Now back to the tower itself, I'm just cutting out these circles on the Proxon. I didn't have a circle cutter at this point, so you can see how janky my circles are. And look at that monstrosity. Using a little bit more of that hard as nails adhesive to stick them all together in a nice tower. I'm leaving one separate, which we'll find out about later. Now time to make 1,000 tiny infuriating bricks. I wanted them to be fairly uneven, so I kind of just chucked some strips of foam through the Proxon to just get some uneven little rectangles and made a big box of them. Now it's not your mum's sewing kit, it is in fact a box of rocks. Yep, there's some rocks, just in case you didn't know what rocks looked like. And then we just add in all of our bricks there, give them a little shake. Some more rocks for a little bit of extra flavour. And then you just want to shake them up. Just shake them really hard until those rocks can make some texture. An absolutely vital part of the process is to get the rocks and the foam bricks everywhere because you didn't hold the lid on tight enough. So clean those up and you're done. I blocked out where the windows are going to be with some card, as I hadn't really quite decided what I was going to do with them yet, and then I used some tacky glue to start gluing down all of the bricks. I tried to make it a little bit more sort of organic and like it really had been just cobbled together, so I didn't really try and make it too neat, but it did take quite a while to stick them all on, and yep, that happened a lot. But it was worth it in the end, and there we are, all done. And don't forget the little piece that we left. Now it's time to grout. Yep, no, yep, just get it in there, come on. Grout time. So I used polyfiller for this, or powder filler. I assume you call it something else in other places, but it's kind of like plaster, but it's got a little bit more adhesive in it, I think, and it's just a little bit better for this process. So I used a palette knife to squish into the spaces, and then a wet cloth and my gloves to smooth it off, get the excess off, and just make sure it was only in the cracks. And once it's all done, it looks like this. And again, don't forget that little bit that we left. Now using your favourite druid spell to commune with the wood inside of these coffee stirrer sticks, we're going to make some wood panelling. So I'm just using a riffler tool to make some exaggerated wood grain texture on the coffee stirrer sticks, and then cutting them up into the right sizes to stick onto this square of XPS foam that I cut. So I actually made this project for a competition run by Neil at Real Terrain Hobbies, and the theme of the competition was medieval fantasy. So this wooden siding is my little bit of extra medieval flair that I tried to add in to make sure we were definitely meeting the theme. So I just stuck them all down in a sort of medieval looking fashion, and when it's all done, and what is that? Don't look at that, don't look at the plaster. Definitely did not slice my finger open doing this. Now I'm just gluing some more stirrer sticks to the bottom just to make a little sort of decking, I suppose, and making sure it fits with the tower. And just like all the other cool kids in school, I've copied Black Magic Craft's patented paint and Mod Podge recipe to seal up all the wooden parts. I also painted over the foam, even though I'm going to cover that, just so that it gets nice and sealed and a little bit stronger, and hopefully the plaster doesn't seep in. I used a little dropper here to pipe some plaster in to make the siding. It was quite hard to do this evenly and neatly, so I just had to do my best. You can see there's plaster everywhere, but it works. It's just realism, guys. I used a little toothpick here as well, just to sort of coax it into those tight little corners, and tapped in between to get the bubbles out. In the end, I used some sandpaper and a little bit more paint to even out where the plaster had gone over. And then I just used some off-white kind of yellowish paint to weather the panels, and I used some paper towel to dab off the extra. This piece is what's going to be on top of the panelled layer, and I hadn't really decided what I would do with it to start with, whether I would do a roof or what, so I decided to just brick it up into a little wall so we could have a little observation deck maybe on top of the tower. I then went back to the main part of the tower. I dug out the shapes of the windows and started adding some UV resin over some previously dried black paint that I'd put in there. I wanted it to kind of look like maybe there was a fire lit inside, so that's why I went for the sort of warm colours on the first layer. I then cured that with a little lamp that came with my UV resin. Pretty handy for this sort of stuff because it's just a nail lamp, I think, so you can just sit on top and leave it there. I used this sculptor's mesh to make the inside part of the window. It comes in the perfect crosshatch design already, so I think it works really well, and I just pushed that in there and covered it with another layer of clear UV resin. I made sure to push it into all of the sides so that it was nice and even, and I think it looks really good when it's all cured. I did add some more bricks around the edges just to give a proper frame, but I think it looks really nice. Try not to make them very outdated 50 Shades of Grey joke. I mixed up my colours for the tower. I wanted a good variety of undertones of grey, and I also used some of these Citadel colours as well, and then started the painstaking process of painting every single brick individually. Now I definitely didn't need to do this, and as you'll see in a minute after the washes, they sort of end up looking mostly the same, but I thought it would add a little bit of something to have them all painted differently, and it looks kind of cool, if a little bit messy at the moment, just because I was in a bit of a rush. But with a bit of a dry brush with a lighter sort of off-white greyish colour, it started to come together a little bit. Then I added a couple layers of a black wash, which is just black ink and water and a little bit of rinse aid to sort of help the flow. It ended up looking a little bit samey after the second coat, but after the first one I just felt like it needed a little bit more. This is after one coat. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but it's okay. Now jumping back to the base for a little bit, another round of Mod Podge and paint. I used grey this time to do a coat on all of the sculpt mould and all of the bark to seal it in on the rocks. I even did it over where it's going to be brown later, and then I just put a little layer of brown over that as well. Then I went in with a sort of heavy dry brush almost of a lighter colour of grey, letting some of that darker grey shine through in the cracks and crevices for a little bit of shadow. And then I struggled for about 5 minutes or so with this bottle of paint. Could not get the paint to come out. Turns out there was some sort of two-factor authentication on this bottle of paint, which required me to cut out 2 different things to get into it, but we did get there in the end. So using these brighter colours really watered down over the grey paint. When it's then gone over again with a black and a brown wash, which is what I'm going to do in a second, it really sort of ties everything together and looks like natural variations in the colour of rock rather than everything being all one flat colour. I really like the effect that this gave. It was the first time I've done this. I've seen it on a few different YouTube videos and I really like it, so I definitely recommend it if you want to try doing that yourself. I just dripped little bits on here and there, making sure to leave some gaps without any of the colours on, just the grey, and dabbed it up with a paper towel. I also added a little bit of sand to the bottom of the lake part and gave that a little coat of paint as well. Off camera, I made a couple of these little huts to attach to the sides. I was starting to run out of time, so I didn't end up filming everything, but they're basically more coffee stirrer sticks, a chopstick for the little beam at the bottom, and then cardboard shingles. They were done with the same brown Mod Podge paint and then a little bit of UV resin, sculptor's mesh, and then a dry brush. I used this Citadel colour that I really like. It's called Tusker Fern. It's a nice warm colour for all of the shingles. I used a layer of that and then I used a lightened up version to dry brush. I did the same on the shingles I added on top of the panelled layer here as well. I also made a little trapdoor for the top of the tower, and you can see me here struggling to add on the little pull handle, which is made of a little bit of a necklace chain. The trapdoor itself is made of coffee stirring sticks and then a little piece of card painted silver. It was now time to start sticking everything together. I used hot glue for this, although there's probably a better option. I was just starting to run out of time and wanted something fast. So I stuck the top part of the tower on, and then I started sticking on the little huts at an angle, trying to figure out something that just looked good from the front, as I wish I'd had time to make more huts to add all the way around, but this is what we ended up with. It looks okay, but I do wish I had made them a little bit more flush fitting against the side. Again, I kind of ran out of time, but there is definitely a bit of a gap there. One way to combat the gap is with a mixture of Mod Podge and green flock. I found this idea on a Studs and Studios video and I really like it. It really seems to help with the seams. Obviously it doesn't look white when it dries. It looks kind of mossy and kind of moldy and really works well. I also added some flock and some old dried herbs that I had to make some leaves and greenery on top of the huts. Flocking is one of my favourite steps, but I do kind of wish I added a little bit more now that I've seen it dried. Now for the most exciting part, watching me glue the tower down to the base, and yep, I did it whilst I was in front of the camera. Well done me, but there we have it. And you can see there that off camera I also added some flock to the base just to do a grass effect, just sprinkled some on. To blend the gaps again, I just used a mixture of Mod Podge and a little bit more sand just to go around the edges. Now some might say I went a little bit ham buying vines and other foliage for this project, but I say to those people, shut up. So I started to add on the vines to the tower. Now this process was so tedious. Getting these little vines to stick on here was difficult. Because they're quite tightly wound in those packets, they just wanted to ping off if you used any glue that took more than a second to dry. So I ended up using UV resin to stick them on, which worked fairly well for the most part, but was a little bit fiddly and delicate to try not get globs of shiny UV resin everywhere, which I did kind of clean up with some matte Mod Podge afterwards, but it just wasn't a super fun process. I added some woodland scenics lichen to the bottom of the lake part, and that was just done with foliage. Next was another of my favourite parts to do, making all the little waterfalls with UV resin. I basically just did lots of layers, lots of drips, curing in between whenever I could. I had originally planned to do one big waterfall, but the way the bark was, I just ended up doing this, and I do really like the effect. I kind of wish I had maybe put some white in some of it, just because it's quite hard to see, especially on camera. I cured some little strips of UV resin on a piece of plastic off to the side, so I could blend them in and make it look like these waterfalls were sort of captured in freeze frame in a moment in time, and the water is just stretching between 2 points on the rock, dripping down, even without anything at the back of it. This took lots of layers to build up, and I sort of went back and forth between different sections and different areas, filling in little pools of resin in some parts, and in other parts just using more of these strips of resin. Again, kind of hard to see on camera, but it is there, I promise. Next was time to prepare for the resin casting. So I used this piece of plastic. I actually think it's the kind of plastic that's used for license plates, don't ask. But I used this and stuck it on. I used hot glue to stick it on. I did end up having to do this twice because the hot glue was a little bit too far away. You can see there's kind of some damage underneath where it's been stuck on previously. I kind of expected the front of the diorama to get a little bit damaged in the process, so I wasn't too worried about it. I knew I'd have to do some patching up anyway. I used some UV resin to seal in all the edges to make sure no resin was going to get out, and now it's time for the moment of truth. You may be asking, why are you in a bathroom? Well, the answer to that is that the resin that I'm about to pour back there is a deep pour resin and needs to be at about 20 to 30 degrees. I've never done any deep pour casting before, anything like this, so good time to start. But I've never done it before, so I'm just going to try and follow that, and it does already take about 3 or so days to cure, which is coincidentally the exact amount of time that I have to get this finished. Fingers crossed it's going to cure in time, but in order to do that apparently I need to keep it at 20 to 30 degrees, which this is Scotland in October, so it's not that temperature by itself here. And there's currently a cost of living and energy crisis on in the UK at the moment, so I can't afford to turn the heating on in the whole house or even a bigger room. So this little bathroom that doesn't get used, don't worry, is the place that I think is most likely that I'm going to be able to keep it at a decent temperature. I don't even know if I'll be able to keep it at that temperature accurately. Just gonna have to see what happens, aren't we? Because, yep, I'm nervous. I am it. Okay, So it was now time to pour this resin. It was pretty difficult to pour this resin well. I usually would do it from a higher height in a smaller stream, but with the camera and the angles of the diorama itself, it just wasn't happening. You can see my hands are very awkwardly twisted, so I just had to pour it in as best I could. It is a really slow curing resin, so I was just hopeful that the bubbles would mostly come out themselves. So I started with one big cup and then another one, and that's that all going in there. You can kind of see between the cuts that it's starting to go down a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, I was a bit worried that the resin was going to just flow right down inside of all the gaps in the bark and just settle in behind there next to the foam, and meaning that I would lose half of the resin down the back. I probably could have done a little bit more to prevent that, but hey ho, here we are. So I ended up using 3 of these cups of resin. It was pretty much all of the resin that I had, the slow curing stuff anyway. Here's the last of it kind of going in there, and I didn't really notice at the time because I was busy mixing up more resin, but you definitely can start to see it go down now in between pours while it's seeping in and away somewhere. But that was all the resin in. I used a lighter to try and get rid of as many bubbles as I can, and it was time to leave it to cure. So we've had some issues. Basically, the pour that you saw me do, which was up here to begin with, ended up down here. You can kind of see the little mark I made, and you can see the lines, so they haven't melded together very well when I did another pour of quick cure over the top, which has cured luckily just in time, and it has sort of peeled away from the sides, but I thought the first layer had just sort of gone in the cracks in the bark and sort of just settled somewhere in the back, in the abyss back there, never to be seen again. Disappointing, but did another pour. It's fine, isn't it? Well, turns out the resin actually went from like this little hole, you can see it's shiny, and now if I zoom back out, the bottom of my project looks like this. So resin, and it is I had it on a bin bag, so it's very uneven. I don't really know what to do about this. So this was roughly about the time I started to have what can only be described as a mental breakdown about this project. There was basically hours to go until the deadline. It was very late at night, and I didn't really know how to fix a lot of the problems I was having with it. So I filled in the gaps first of all with some UV resin, just to make sure that the parts where I'd pulled away were kind of filled in and looked a little bit more even. Whilst I was doing this though, I started to realise that my UV resin wasn't curing properly. It was staying sticky, which according to Google happens often, but is there any real way to fix it? Not really. So I just had to trudge on in pain and sadness and try a few times and fail and eventually get off the dam that I'd made at the front of it. I will eventually get it off one of these days. Yep. Oh, and there she goes. Yep, lovely. So I had to inspect the damage and get rid of all the hot glue, trying not to make more damage as I went. My original plan to fix the damage that I knew was inevitable kind of involved that UV resin, so again, it was very late, I was very tired and very stressed, and I didn't really know how to fix it. So first thing I did was cover it in a little bit of paint. Not sure why I thought this was a good idea, didn't really help, but here we are. I think it's important to show that not everything goes well all the time, and that is definitely what happened here. In the meantime, to try and have a think about what I was going to do with the rest of it, I used some gel medium to make some little ripples and waves on the surface of the water, just where the waterfalls would have hit, or some of the edges where I thought there might have been some water disturbance. I didn't want to do too much as I wanted to see mostly clear resin, but it was a nice effect. Now to try and fix the elephant in the room, the front of this thing. You can see there's a pretty big gap where the resin kind of protrudes from the front of the diorama, obviously because it wasn't even when I put on. And as I say, I kind of planned for this eventuality, but my plan wasn't going to work without the UV resin. So I ended up using more Sculpting mold that I tinted grey with a little bit of paint and just sort of smushing that into the gap and around and trying to blend it in just so that it would look a little bit more natural and I could paint it to match the rest of the rocks that were there. Kind of turned out to be the best solution I could think of just because I didn't really have time to sand things back. As you can see, there are some little bubbles stuck on the surface of the resin there as well, which I didn't really have time to deal with. And with the Sculpting mold all stuck on, I was just praying and hoping that it was going to dry in time for the deadline, which was not very far away at this point. So I managed to quickly paint it off camera just before it was time to do the beauty shots. despite all of the disasters that occurred and the fact that the resin pour will haunt me in my dreams, I guess it's a rite of passage that it had to go wrong at some point. In all the times I've poured resin, nothing's ever gone wrong, so I guess it had to be on a big project. But I'm fairly happy with how things came out in the end, and I even managed to get a runner-up spot in the contest, which was pretty cool and not something I expected. I just wanted to take part for the fun of it. So thank you to Neil for running a contest that inspired me to make this diorama, and thank you to all of you for watching. This is my first attempt at making a video like this, so please do give me any feedback you'd like, I would appreciate it, and please like and subscribe and all of those things that I'm apparently supposed to say at the end of one of these things. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.